if only because it is actually quite accurate to today. In that, if a discipline itself as a whole becomes remarkably biased in one particular direction, and loses any diversity of thought and viewpoint diversity in it, then yeah, where are the advances in that scientific discipline? They're not there anymore. This is going to be a little more cerebral. Because you can obviously tell I don't have an article on the screen that's somewhat recent, but I was thinking about a few things related to peer review and commentary and what have you. Apologize, I'm chuckling somewhat because I noticed that cats are exuberantly running today, so they may make some appearances. We'll see. But peer review itself, I've talked about it on this channel. It is a way to check and challenge, poke and prod, and make sure those things that a journal would be publishing are actually founded on good science. There is at times a perception or a belief that if it's peer reviewed, it's great. It's awesome. Everybody thinks that way. If you've been living in the academic world long enough to know, and most of you who may be watching who are academics would probably agree with this sentiment, though I don't, of course, don't speak for everybody, that the idea that something is peer-reviewed does not mean that everybody in the discipline agrees upon it. Indeed, you can find peer-reviewed articles that are arguing completely opposite points from each other, and discussing the findings of different results and coming to completely different conclusions. Two different things there going on. But I did want to make a point, and I'm going to go through with a couple of articles to make that point, and also one thing at the end, which I think was actually very well put here when people forget about it. But this comes from the Royal Society of Medicine, or the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, I should say. Peer review, a flawed process at the heart of science and journals. What is peer review? Peer review is at the heart of the processes of not just medical journals, but of all of science. It is a method by which grants are allocated, papers published, academics promoted, and Nobel Prizes won, yet it is hard to define. It has until recently been unstudied. Now, I will note this is a 2006 article, so I don't think that's as true, perhaps, but could be wrong. And its defects are easier to identify than its attributes, yet it shows no signs of going away. Famously, it is compared with democracy, a system full of problems, but the least worst we have. When something is peer-reviewed, it is in some sense blessed. Even journalists recognize this. When the I forget what the name of that journal is. When the BMJ published a highly controversial paper that argued that a new disease, female sexual dysfunction, was in some ways being created by pharmaceutical companies, a friend who is a journalist was very excited. Not least because reporting it gave him a chance to get his topic onto the front page of a highly respectable but somewhat priggish newspaper. But the news editor wanted to know, was this paper peer-reviewed? The implication was that if it had been good enough for the front page, and if it had not been, it was not. Well, had it been, I had read much more carefully than I read my many papers, and had asked the author, who happened to be a journalist, to revise the paper and produce more evidence. But this was not peer review, even though I was a peer of the author and had reviewed the paper. Or was it? I told my friend that it had not been peer reviewed, but it was too late to pull the story from the front page. This is again why you should be careful with studies going on, and what is said about them in the news media. Just to make that point. My point is that peer review is impossible to define in operational terms. An operational definition is one whereby if 50 of us looked at the same process, we could all agree most of the time whether or not it was peer-reviewed. Peer review is thus like poetry, love, or justice, but it is something to do with a grant application or a paper being scrutinized by a third party, who is neither the author nor the person making the judgment on whether a grant should be given or a paper published, but who is a peer. Somebody doing exactly the same kind of research, in which he or she is probably a direct competitor, somebody in the same discipline, somebody who is an expert on the methodology. And what is review? Somebody saying the paper looks all right to me, which is sadly what peer review sometimes seems to be. And that complaint there is a valid complaint with respect to peer review, if only because nowadays in particular, there's so many articles being put together. You yourself, if you are reviewing other articles, are probably also writing articles that you're trying to get published. And so sometimes, yes, you do have that. Or somebody poring over all the paper, asking for raw data, repeating analyses, checking all the references, and making detailed suggestions for improvement. Such a review is vanishingly rare. What is clear is that the forms of peer review are protean. Probably the systems of every journal and every grant-giving body are different in at least some detail, and some systems are very different. There may be even some journals using the following classic system. The editor looks at the title of the paper and sends it to two friends whom the editor thinks know something about the subject. If both advise publication, the editor sends it to the printers. If both advise against publication, the editor rejects the paper. If the reviewers disagree, the editor sends it to a third reviewer and does whatever he or she advises. This pistache, which is not far from systems I have seen used, is a little better than tossing a coin, because the level agreement between reviewers on whether a paper should be published is a little better than you'd expect by chance. That is why Robbie Fox, the great 20th century editor of The Lancet, who was no admirer of peer review, wondered whether anybody would notice if he were to swap the piles marked publish and reject. He also joked that The Lancet had a system of throwing a pile of papers down the stairs and publishing those that reached the bottom. When I was editor of the BMJ, I was challenged by two of the cleverest researchers in Britain to publish an issue of the journal comprised only of papers that had failed peer review and see if anybody noticed. I wrote back, quote, "How do you know I haven't already done it?" It is an interesting commentary. I will not doubt that. Now, for the record, I do think that, quote, peer review has its uses, but it must be reviewers who take a decent amount of time and actually go through an article they're being asked to review, to look at it critically, to see if the arguments make sense, does the method make sense, does all these other kinds of things make sense. By the way, there'll be something new coming from this channel on that sometime in the future. We're working on that one. But review where it's just like, whatever, it looks good to me. Congratulations, you have done actually nothing to critique an article. Now, I will say the whole process of peer review is actually somewhat well defined, because most journals seem to use the same kind of review process, in that you submit an article, an editor does a sort of baseline review. Does this even meet the scope of the journal? Then they send it out for review. Oftentimes, the author is asked to provide folks for the editor to reach out to. Sometimes they get used, sometimes they sometimes they don't. Fair enough. And then, of course, you wait for review commentary. There's the back and forth, and hopefully at the end of that line you get published. That sort of general process. The exact system, of course, of publication for different journals is different. That is not an incorrect statement. But what you hope for, of course, is that you get reviewers who are going to take the time to review the article carefully. And review, what do we mean? Well, at a very minimum, you got to critique the arguments. You have to see, okay, does this person even have anything that falls, how should I say this? Are they knowledgeable of previous work? How about that? In the field, do they recognize the limits of the methodology? Did they put together an appropriate methodology? Is the methodology using data that's accessible? Where is the data, kind of thing? Is the conclusions actually in line with what their data shows? In other words, if you put in a figure and then they make a statement based upon that figure, does that actually make any damn lick of sense? Or is there something else going on? So I do think peer review has its values. And of course, why do we bother doing this? Because in the process of doing peer review, the ideal is we're going to be checking each other's biases and hopefully finding those things that are not very good, very clever ideas, and this should not be published. Now, this is somewhat different from science itself, per se, where you're talking about the process of science with hypothesis and experimental testing and what have you. That is a lot of work that takes place generally before you get to peer review. And so the point here to say is that peer review and science are certainly as heck not the same thing. Do, 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 do. Now, they go on here with this article to talk a bit about the defects of peer review, which it can be slow and expensive. Um, Many journals, even the age of internet, take more than a year to review and publish a paper. It is hard to get good data on the cost of peer review, particularly because reviewers are often not paid. This is very true. Reviewers and journal editors typically are not paid for their work. Yet there is a substantial opportunity cost, as economics call it, in the time spent reviewing that could be spent doing something more productive, like your own original research. Many reviewers, many editors are themselves trying to get stuff published. I estimate that the average cost of peer review for the per paper for BMJ, remembering that the journal rejected 60% without external review, was on the order of £100, which I do not know what that is in US dollars off the top of my head. Whereas the cost of a paper that made it right through the system was closer to £1,000. Inconsistent. People have a great many fantasies about peer review, and one of the most powerful is that it is highly objective, reliable, and consistent process. Yep. Sometimes the inconsistency can be laughable. Here is an example of two reviewers commenting on the same papers. Now, I have had this problem myself when I've gone to get articles published, in that that one reviewer say one thing and one reviewer say the other thing, and this is why it's helpful to have three reviewers, because then you can hopefully get something in the middle. And editors then do have a situation of figuring out what to do in that particular situation. So this does happen. It's not unheard of. Bias, the evidence on whether there was bias in peer review, yes. Abuse of peer review, and then they go on to make some suggestions here about this. But all of this is to say, peer review, it is a potentially powerful tool, but it is not without its faults, for sure. And in particular, I think one of the failings of peer review, in particular disciplines, was shown quite clearly by the grievance studies affair. It actually came up indirectly in, if you recall, this particular article, Pro-Social Motives Underlie Scientific Censorship by Scientists, a Research Agenda. It came up here with this actual particular figure down here, which Lee actually showed when he appeared on a Side Chat Saturday episode, but it also ended up here, in that you have peer review, you have published literature that is peer-reviewed, and it suggests X is true, but you also have a whole bunch of studies that don't necessarily get accepted. And this is why I find it so important to emphasize two things. Peer review itself is not science. Those are two separate processes. Keep that very clearly on the mind with this. But at the same time, those things that challenge and push the frontiers and what have you don't necessarily come from the really strongly established literature that generally forms to coalesce around a particular topic. It emerges and challenges it. And so it takes a decent amount of time to actually get published when it's basically pushing against something that might be accepted in a larger body of literature. And that is part of the problem, of the point with this particular figure. And that's, again, to make the point here that peer review and science are not the same, but also that this is very much, again, a good example of why, when you're doing peer review and when you're doing science just more generally, you have to have viewpoint diversity. You cannot get away from that. If you don't have the viewpoint diversity involved, you have the sincere problem that you may very well be preferencing yourself toward existing literature and toward an existing viewpoint simply because it is peer-reviewed. And this doesn't help actually to advance science and to be thinking about something. Now, do I think peer review should be thrown by the wayside? No, I do not think that. And the grievance studies affair was a pretty crazy example of just how wild it could get in a discipline that is woefully ideologically biased. And that is pretty much what they found with that is there's ideological bias in that particular discipline, and the result was tremendous number of papers getting passed because they had nobody who could think about a problem differently to realize, oh, wait a second, that that paper is a piece of garbage until you had a Wall Street Journal journalist actually figure it out. Because that was what actually brought the whole thing to an end because they had more papers and they could have kept going, and they've talked about it elsewhere. But it was a Wall Street Journal journalist who managed to figure out that they were pulling off a hoax. But here's actually where I want to finish. Oh, hold on. Because this article here, this video here from that Theo Jordan has put up here. And this is a little, this is a couple of days, this is yesterday when he came back with it, but this is a useful understanding of not getting sucked into the notion that because it's peer-reviewed, everybody must agree with it. So this is a really good piece.
What is science? People talk glibly about science. What is science? People coming out of a university with a master's degree or a PhD, you take them into the field, and they literally don't believe anything unless there's a peer-reviewed paper. It's the only thing they accept. And you say to them, but let's observe, let's think, let's discuss. They don't do it. It's just, is it in a peer-reviewed paper or not? That's their view of science. I think it's pathetic. Gone into universities as bright young people, they come out of them brain dead, not even knowing what science means. They think it means peer-reviewed papers, etc. No, that's academia. And if a paper is peer-reviewed, it means everybody thought the same, therefore they approved it. An unintended consequence is that when new knowledge emerges, new scientific insights, they can never, ever be peer-reviewed. So we're blocking all new advances in science that are big advances. If you look at the breakthroughs in science, almost always they don't come from the center of that profession. They come from the fringe. The finest candle makers in the world couldn't even think of electric lights. They don't come from within. They often come from outside the breaks. We're going to kill ourselves because of stupidity.
So I love that piece with the ecologist there who's talking with everyone. And if only because it is actually quite accurate to today. In that, if a discipline itself as a whole becomes remarkably biased in one particular direction, and loses any diversity of thought and viewpoint diversity in it, then, yeah, where are the advances in that scientific discipline? They're not there anymore because you've basically made it impossible for any new thoughts to emerge from the fringe. Yes, be challenged, be critiqued, be reviewed, as it were, but they won't even emerge at all if it has to all come from peer review. Well, what if it comes from the fringe and it's challenging something that has been long and established in peer-reviewed literature? So I say all this just to say, as my thoughts on this, yes, peer review can be a powerful tool. Yes, Lord only knows it has its flaws. Well, not Lord only knows. Everybody here reading can know sometimes that peer review has its flaws. But it is particularly a problem if a discipline becomes ideologically biased in one particular direction or another, as shown by the grievance studies affair. What happens when you have that kind of degree of bias. But that's the point that I wanted to make today, just as I was thinking about peer review. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. May you stay curious, everybody.